Hello. Hello and welcome everyone. Following the words of our colleague, Dr. Felicia Mitchell, who's an expert on American Indian water insecurity in the United States, we acknowledge with respect that the physical locations of Arizona State University are within the ancestral homelands of those American Indian tribes that have sustained connections to its land and waters since time immemorial, including the Akimel Odam or Pima, Pipash or Maricopa, and Tohono O'odham peoples. Our panel today is focused on household water insecurity in the global north. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the intellectual vision of our colleague, Professor Katie Meehan, who's on the faculty of King's College London and is a Plus Alliance Fellow. While she couldn't be with us today, her scholarship has inspired ours and profoundly shaped our thinking. We'd also like to acknowledge the many contributions, some of which we'll have time to mention today, of our colleagues in the National Science Foundation funded Research Collaborative Network on Household Water Insecurity. For members of the audience who would like to learn more, you can visit HWISE-RCN.org and join our community of practice. We'd like to ask the audience to please type questions in the Q&A box. We will answer questions at the end of the formal panel presentation in about 30 minutes. Now to introduce you to our 5 fabulous panelists, please tell us your names, where you work, and what you work on. We'll follow in order from the newest scholars to the most established.
Thank you, Dr. Woodich. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to be with us today. My name is Anaís Roque, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Arizona State University, and my work focuses on water sharing practices, social networks, and self-management using the case of my homeland, Puerto Rico, in the wake of Hurricane Maria. I'm affiliated to the Center of Global Health and also to the RISE Network, which is an inter-university network that mixes scholars and communities in the area of disasters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Lucero Radonich, and I'm an environmental anthropologist and an assistant professor at Michigan State University, where I'm affiliated with the Department of Anthropology and the Environmental Sciences and Policy program. My research specifically looks and analyzes how different stakeholders make sense and transform water policies and how they differentially engage with diverse water infrastructures. I look at what are the strategies used by residents and policy makers and how they can work together to create more resilient and equitable communities. Most of my research has taken place in different parts of Mexico. I did my dissertation in Sonora, and in different parts of the United States, mostly in Michigan and in Arizona. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Woodich. I'm a President's Professor and Anthropologist at Arizona State University. I'm also Director of ASU's Center for Global Health and Associate Director of its Institute for Social Science Research. My research examines how unjust and inequitable water institutions shape human health outcomes, especially mental ill health. I direct cross-cultural studies and do ethnographic research here in Arizona and in Paraguay and Bolivia. I'm the PI of a new National Science Foundation grant for growing convergence research around the co-evolution of social and physical infrastructure to improve access to clean water and informal water sharing systems in colonias in the Southwest US, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Wendy, you're muted.
No. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Wendy Jepson. I am a geographer and university professor at Texas A&M University. I have several roles, first as Associate Director for the Texas Water Resources Institute. I also lead the National Science Foundation Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network, along with Dr. Woodich, and in collaboration with many researchers here today, including Dr. Brewis. We are dedicated to building a community of practice that fosters key analytics and theoretical advances to examine and understand the causes and outcomes of water insecurity at the household scale. And my own research, similar to Dr. Woodich, examines dimensions of unjust and inequitable water systems and institutions. But for me, I have my eye towards the causes of water injustice from a political economic perspective. And currently I have research projects in Brazil where I've worked since 1997, in northern Mexico, the US, Israel, Australia, and Africa.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Brewis, and I'm here in sunny Arizona, where I'm a President's Professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at ASU. We're sorry that the AAAS folks couldn't join us here in person in Phoenix, but hopefully one day you can. Our school houses anthropology, global health, and environmental social science programs. And I'm personally trained as a human biologist, a demographer, and an anthropologist, and much of my research focuses on how human biology and culture intersect, and particularly how that shapes health outcomes. In relation to water, our focus here, part of my efforts are to connect the experiences of water insecurity to health outcomes, including mental health, but also more recently, we've been looking at how it connects to chronic disease, such as hypertension. I work in many different parts of the world on collaborative projects from Phoenix here in Arizona. We currently also have projects running in places like Zambia and Ethiopia.
Thank you, everyone. To begin, can you tell us why water security in the global north is a myth and how your own research sheds light on this? Dr. Jepson, can you begin?
Thank you. I think the real issue here is to consider how our definitions change and develop over time. So for many years, the term water security really refers to large scale geopolitical or hydrological challenges of water supply. And I think in these ways, indeed, water insecurity has been discussed in the context of advanced economies or the global north. However, there's another framing of water insecurity that is often not envisioned as a global north problem, and that would be water insecurity as it relates to human development. So in this way, water insecurity is defined as the inability to access and benefit from affordable, adequate, reliable, and safe water for well-being and a healthy life. And so water insecurity in this sense then has often been seen as an exception in the global north. It seems to go contrary to what some see as indeed the symbol of modern development, that is centralized water provision. And the idea that indeed everyone in the global north or higher income countries clearly has access to water. So what we want to do then is to rethink water insecurity more broadly, one that incorporates broader experiences around water relationships, thinking about quality, affordability, trust, even control. And so in HWISE, I think the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Network, what we've done over the past 5 years is to move this discussion about water insecurity in a new direction. And through that, we've been able to, through empirical and analytical approaches, really bust this myth. And we're going to talk a lot more about that today. But what's critical here is that we want to situate not only gaps in water provision and all of the various experiences around insecurity at the household level, but also place them and squarely within the existing political economic systems and failure. So indeed, they're not exceptions to centralized water provision, but we want to recenter them as being part of these larger economic situations in these political economic contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Jepson. As Dr. Jepson mentioned, the myth of 100% water coverage in the US and Canada has recently been shattered. That research, which was led by Dr. Katie Meehan and 22 experts in 2020, showed that many households rely on water sources that are expensive, unsafe, unreliable, and inaccessible. Water insecurity is more common in the US for renters and people living in mobile homes, for disaster migrants and others living in substandard housing, for American Indians and First Nations in Canada, for Black and Hispanic communities, and in colonias and disadvantaged unincorporated communities. More than 2 million people in the United States live without household access to clean water. In my own work, I focus on colonias, or small unincorporated settlements on the US-Mexico border. There are approximately 2,000 colonias in Texas, 150 in New Mexico, 85 in Arizona, and 15 in California. Many are water insecure and lack standard regulated water infrastructure. Instead, people rely on water service that's delivered through informal water systems. There's a long history of exploring what has been called water poverty and other forms of water-related deprivation and injustice in Arizona and across the United States. And this research shows us that water insecure in communities in the US are forced to depend on water vendors and self-provisioning infrastructure that makes them vulnerable to high water costs and low water quality. Dr. Brewis.
So as an anthropologist, I come at this question by thinking about how people really experience water insecurity on the ground. And one of the things that we've been seeing is that there is enormous variability within the US even in how people experience water insecurity. So we've been working at a site in the east of Phoenix that is highly water insecure, a community in which there is no main service at all, even though it's proximate to the city itself, and people have to pay for and haul water to support their households. And they have to haul it from the city and up the hill every week or several times a week. What's really interesting about this case study that I think sort of tells a slightly different story than all the other research that this group has been doing is that this is probably the only case that we've seen that I know of where people are really positively defining themselves as a community on the basis of water insecurity. So rather than often perceiving it as a risk, they see it as a symbol of independent self-sufficiency and so on, which means there's been very little activism in this community to push for mains delivery. That just doesn't mean that people aren't suffering from water. The water that comes up from the wells is unsafe, and it takes an enormous number of hours every week to collect the water. So it is very, very costly. It's also unusual in that it's men in this community that are responsible for fetching water, which on a global scale is an extremely unusual situation. So one of the things that focus on water security in the global north is having us ask new questions about the universality of that experience. And I'm particularly interested in how this might or might not translate into psychosocial stress that we can measure.
Thank you, Dr. Burris. Next is Dr. Radonich.
So an important dimension of water security, I think it's precariousness. As an example, I'm going to share with you the case of the city of Tucson in Arizona. Tucson has over 99.5% coverage, and it has an increasing block rate system, which means that the more water a household uses, the more they pay for the unit of water. So the system was designed to incentivize water conservation, and it has been incredibly successful at that, which is very important when considering that the area is undergoing a multi-decade drought and is likely to face cutbacks from the Colorado River, which is its main source. During the summer months, which are very hot, water use at the household level nearly doubles, with people using more water indoors and outdoors. So think here about evaporative cooling, watering shade trees, vegetable gardens. So when a household water usage goes up in the summer, their bill could go up even faster than the usage if the usage enters the next higher rate block in the pay structure. So this puts many low-income Hispanic families in a precarious conditions as they have to eliminate water uses to remain afloat. It is not rare for families to let their few trees die because they cannot afford the water or stop watering the vegetable crops. So if we go back to the definition of water security that Drs. Jepson, Woodage, and colleagues put forward in 2017 article, what we see here is that low-income households have to eliminate water uses that allow for the sustained development of human capabilities and well-beings. They have to narrow their use up to the very minimum. In this way, the precariousness of water insecurity at multiple scales, as the case of Tucson shows, invites us to consider water insecurity as a spectrum and as fluid rather than just an off or on kind of fixed descriptor. And I think that furthermore, as we have seen through the cases of Flint and the case of Puerto Rico that Anais Roque is going to describe, water provisioning systems are more fragile and vulnerable than we often think. So thinking through this idea of precariousness in people's experience through seasonality, it's important.
Thank you, Dr. Radonich. Soon to be Dr. Roque.
Yes, in my research in water insecurity in Puerto Rico, water insecurity has been shown to be a myth, primarily because of the fragile water infrastructure that the water system has in Puerto Rico when it has our impact. So when Hurricane Maria impacted Puerto Rico, the water system was shattered. 92% of the population was without water services. But prior Hurricane Maria, the water system has been shown to have high leakages, and on top of that, contaminants that exceeds the levels according to the Clean Water Act. So in this sense, water insecurity has been shown to be a myth, both because of the impact of ASAR, but also at the same time, even though in normal times, communities have access to water, this water is not safe to drink. So in this sense, households have to go and spend money getting water from supermarkets and other formal sources. So we can see that even though there is a large scale water system infrastructure put in place, the type of water, the quality of water that households are receiving is not acceptable for them. So water insecurity is shown through those effects.
Thank you. The idea that scholarship has promoted a myth of water security in the global north suggests that our concepts or theories haven't been adequate. If you could suggest one major theoretical or conceptual change to how scholars understand water insecurity in the global north, what would it be? Dr. Jepson, can you begin?
Thank you. So as mentioned before, the notion or myth of universal provision has really blinded water researchers to the notion, first of all, that water security is only access. And I think we've done much to discuss the complexities of the experiences, the precarity that Dr. Radonich mentioned earlier around accessing water, cost of water, trust in water. And I think that, it really demands that we examine these accrued experiences of insecurity, right? So how do we theorize around missing water payments, frequently asking neighbors to help you get water from the water mill, for example, and constantly being concerned that the water you can barely afford will in the long term kill you. So I think that those experiences we need to sort of theorize collectively. But more importantly, we need to ask the question of how does racial disparity, gender, and poverty shape these experiences, and what role does water governance structures reproduce those inequities, I think are critical questions. And so I come to think of it in this way, that instead of thinking about Flint as an exception, which is how it's been framed in the popular media, I think we need to sort of turn it on its head. We need to ask how Flint and perhaps and many other water insecurity experiences are not the exception, but maybe the direct consequence of racial capitalism.
Thank you, Dr. Jepson. The concept I would suggest is affordability. When water is treated as a commodity, people who are poor also tend to be water insecure. Here's an example. Dr. Asher Rossinger at Penn State University led a study that examined data from across the United States in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, between 2007 and 2014. He found that people who were immigrants or minoritized racial groups were much more likely to drink bottled water and less likely to drink tap water. The reason for this, of course, is, we believe, is that immigrants and minoritized populations are much more likely to suffer environmental injustices, living where the water is contaminated or insufficiently treated. So people buy tap water to protect their family's health. The problem is that bottled water costs about 2,000 times as much as tap water. And affordability also matters because in many places around the US, people's water gets shut off if they can't pay a bill. And there are huge reconnection fees. So this is why I believe affordability is at the heart of water insecurity in the global north. Dr. Radonich.
So my concept would be acceptability. And not all waters are the same. And yes, I am using the plural form of waters here. Scholars have shown that experiences of water insecurity are mediated through meanings ascribed to water in its myriad cultural dimensions. Water cleanliness and sufficiency are culturally specific and dependent on geographic and social positions of people. This issue of acceptability is tremendously important as the heterogeneity of water sources is diversifying. We're seeing how new technologies and accompanying policies make new sources of water available for domestic consumption. Consider here rainwater, desal water, and reclaimed water, that is sewage that is treated to drinking water standards. Very explanation, simplified explanation. So what is considered safe and acceptable by regulators may not be considered so by consumers. And not all consumers will perceive and experience all waters in the same way. So when studying household water insecurity and how to address it in the global north, we need to ask what types of water are acceptable, for what use, and by whom.
Thank you. Dr. Brewis?
So the word that I would choose is buffering. So far we've been talking a lot about household level of water insecurity, but I think one thing we can do is crack the door open and step into the household and see what's happening in terms of how different members are carrying the burden of water insecurity. For example, our recent research using large Nepalese data set has shown that women who do the water fetching have an enormous amount of attendant mental health effects associated with that, but the men in the same household have absolutely none. So we're also starting to think about how age and other roles within the household might mean that some people are buffering the risk of water insecurity to the benefit of others. So I think that this is a very important thing to think about, who is literally carrying the burden of water and how that fits into things like the health outcomes within the household, such as child growth, mental health, and physical risks that people are accruing differently.
Thank you, Dr. Brewis. Soon to be Dr. Roque.
Yes, I will have to use the term of self-management. I believe that it is important for water scholars to think about how political and economic dynamics at the state level, such as neoliberalism in Puerto Rico and even in Flint, Michigan, impact the maintenance of water quality of large water systems. And thinking also about how communities that are impacted by this, which are usually Black, Latinx, or under poverty level, are working and organizing outside of the state to bring the human right of water. So in this sense, this will really allow us to bring new conversations of how the global norths compound the vulnerability that we can see through racial or colonial models, perpetuate water insecurity in places like Flint, Puerto Rico, North Carolina, and others.
Thank you. So what are the most important things that research tells us can be done to address water insecurity in the global north? Dr. Jepson.
Thank you. So in order to address the urgent needs for safe, adequate, affordable water for a healthy life, I think we need to fundamentally rethink the role of the state and state institutions. And so this leads us to consider new modalities of governance and regulation, again, to support and improve water security. So I have kind of three in mind. First and foremost, I think very clearly we need to have a permanent national water debt forgiveness program and a moratorium on water shutoffs. As Dr. Wooditch mentioned, affordability and reconnection fees are a real burden. And it's currently, acute for this pandemic, as we know. And in many cases, water moratoria have been implemented, but it needs to become permanent. In the global north, water debt is a reality. The California Water Board just did a study that found Californians have over $1 billion in water debt, and this needs to stop. Second, I think the EPA needs to leverage its power as part of the Clean, Safe Drinking Water Act to demand a higher and more transparent process of reporting. Larger water utilities do this quite well, but we need to realize that literally thousands of communities, often low income and communities of color, depend on small and medium sized water systems that have a very poor record in both compliance and reporting. So this leads to, again, an ability to have transparent information on existing water systems. And third, I think links to what Anais mentioned, which is we need to retool state programs to support self-management. That is, many rural communities have private wells or septic systems, and rather than the state walking away from private systems, which currently the structures are, I strongly think that we need to invest in new programs and regulatory frameworks that support self-management where it exists.
Thank you. Pivoting off Dr. Jepson's third point, our research shows that social infrastructure, so cultural norms, informal institutions, and social networks, importantly amplify a range of water self-provisioning techniques to improve water insecurity in communities that are suffering. One example is in water vending, when water entrepreneurs sell water to households using tanker trucks, water points, or even hand carts. This can be an effective form of water delivery, but it's also often unregulated, expensive, and unreliable. My work with Dr. Melissa Beresford and Cynthia Carvajal shows that social infrastructure like water vendors unions or neighborhood oversight boards can help ensure vendors deliver affordable, fair, and reliable water. While social infrastructure in water provisioning tends to work well, Dr. Jepson and I have argued that we need to be aware of asking too much of communities that are already suffering. We should never expect low-income communities to survive on self-provisioning alone. Engaging social infrastructure demands different services and support from state agencies, water utilities, and policymakers to ensure the safety of all drinking water resources. Dr. Brewis.
So to extend that to a further example, one particular water insecurity related phenomena that we've had some luck in identifying in the last couple of years has been water sharing between households as a response to household water insecurity. Now, water is a super interesting resource because it often shifts from a public good to a private good when it enters the home. For example, when it moves from the mains through the tap, it's now or comes from the well into the household. So we've been thinking quite a bit about how water systems might then extend back out into communities from private households through the practice of water sharing. So households helping each other out by moving water directly between them. And we've started looking at data in different places and found that water sharing probably seems to be both a mechanism for alleviating water insecurity related stress, but also sets up other stresses to do with the complex net of relationships that come around it and obligations. Dr. Roque has been leading some of this research in Puerto Rico for the team, but we have many, many questions left to ask, let alone answer, around water sharing, like why networks activate. Can they really be sustained over time, or are they just a crisis response? And who, when and how are those beneficial versus costly to the people that engage in them?
Thank you. Dr. Rilnich.
I think another aspect to pay attention to is the role of communities of practice and lay knowledge about simple technologies to increase water security. An example here would be rainwater harvesting systems. This is a low-cost technology that creates a new water source for multiple uses inside and outside the house. In Tucson, we found that many people who had immigrated from rural locations across Latin America were collecting the rain to supplement tap water. Rainwater was considered a better quality and low-cost water source. And through the activism of local communities of practice, the local government began to offer incentives and grants to increase and size up implementation. Of course, as Dr. Woodich mentioned, in this case, rainwater is not a viable or a just alternative for provisioning houses with water for all of its uses. Rather, it is a practice that may reduce seasonal vulnerability to water insecurity. Households can rely on it to maintain their outdoor vegetation alive during the summer months without risking their household budget. And this is particularly helpful for low-income families. So the attention here is to see, maybe a little bit related to what Anais was mentioning, what is the knowledge involved in self-provisioning?
Thank you. Soon to be Dr. Roque.
Yes, to building on your conversation, Dr. Brewer's conversation, on social networks and water sharing, I think that social networks are an essential component on thinking about addressing water insecurity. The literature on water networks and water insecurity have shown that they can support collective actions towards risk, flow of information. And my research in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria speaks to this. People were able to organize themselves thinking about their personal networks and use them strategically to address water insecurity. However, it is important to note that social networks can also have downsides. So, for example, if you don't have a diverse network, you may not be able to find sufficient water. And even if you have a diverse network, you have to also think of the quality of the water that you're receiving from, meaning that it can be water for drinking, but it can also be water for sanitation or other needs at the household level. So it is important to use these type of techniques, and they can serve in disaster situations like after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, but also be very conscious to decision makers like emergency managers that this is only a reactive, it can only be used as a response base, meaning that we cannot, like it was previously mentioned, make communities, especially low-income communities, to be depending on their networks to be able to be water secure. So I think that centering the conversation around social networks can indeed be helpful as a disaster strategy, but not as a long-sustained water security modality.
Thank you. And I'd just like to reiterate our invitation to people who are attending to put your questions in the Q&A. We just have one, so we'll proceed to one last question for the panelists, and then we'll pivot to the Q&A. So the last question is, what do you think are some of the most important things to put on a roadmap for future research and policy on water insecurity in the global north? Dr. Jepson.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about two things. I think first, we still have plenty of formative work ahead to build a stronger understanding of the experiential dimensions of water insecurity. And one promising area ties together the poorly understood dynamic of water sanitation and health insecurity, kind of water insecurity in general, and urban homeless population. This is really an interesting area, and I wanted to highlight an early career scholar working in this theme. So Johanna Vilar from University of Southern California is working on these questions, and she's employing a diverse set of mixed methods that creatively weaves health geography, GIS, and current theories on water insecurity. And I think that her ability to get at those experiential dimensions of water insecurity, that of the unhoused, really is a new area that I want to identify. But more importantly, or in addition to, she really works at the community level. So it's not just what we do, but how we do it. And I think that her work is an exemplar of how to advance community-based scholarship in water insecurity, which has clear lines to policy and practice. And so I would like to highlight that. So again, thinking about water insecurity and the urban homeless population. And secondly, I think there's a clear need further to advance metrics of water insecurity. And so, for example, we've only begun to really consider how to measure household water insecurity. Dr. Wooditch mentioned the complexity of affordability, and that plays a part in this. So again, there are many different areas that we could approach this question. But ultimately, I think that in order to have and to broaden out and to deepen our understanding of these dynamics and also lead to clear policy solutions, a larger data set and a more robust toolkit really to measure water insecurity in these contexts is important. It'll allow us again to talk about water affordability in relation to other essential needs such as food and housing. It also allows us to do analysis in terms of correlates with race, ethnicity, and immigration status. So again, metrics could assess these trade-offs, opportunity costs, and really provide a further line of inquiry to bust this myth of universal provision.
Thank you. Dr. Wooditch.
I think one of the first things that I would put in the roadmap is looking at the impacts of climate change in household water security. There's a growing body of research in anthropology and related fields looking at the interconnections between climate change and water resources. And I think, for example, of the work by Elizabeth Marino at Oregon State. She has studied the relationship between socially constructed vulnerabilities, climate change, and human migration in Northwestern Alaska. But I think we need to follow this analytical thread to the household level to study the connections between climate change, and I'm thinking here fires, floods, droughts, and household water security. This is especially important when considering the large number of people in the global north that are dependent either on small provisioning water systems or on private water provisioning. So I think through ethnographic methods, we can identify how is it that informal institutions, social networks, or lay knowledge, as the ones my colleagues and I have described here today, may create conditions of resilience to the impacts of climate change at the household level. So this is one thing. And then a second tiny point, which Dr. Brewis mentioned before, I think it's important to draw more attention to intersectionality on how the burdens of water security are managed at the household level.
Thank you. Dr. Brewis.
So to follow up a number of different threads that have come out in response to this question, one thing that has started to emerge in a lot of our conversations within the HWISE-RCN has been around moving beyond thinking about water quantity and thinking more about the quality of water and how to capture that adequately into the way that water insecurity is being understood, studied, and acted on. If we take a parallel lesson from the food insecurity research, we see that the types and qualities of food matter greatly to how people experience food insecurity. And inability to access culturally appropriate and the types of foods that have positive values for them in social terms is linked to social and psychological stress or its alleviation. So for example, in the Phoenix area, we've been working with Katie Meehan and other scholars to start looking at how people might negatively socially devalue people who are dependent or use tap water in the context of the city. And this is a start, so think not just about water quality as a physical property, but also as a social property with health impacts.
Thank you. Soon to be Dr. Joke.
Yes, I will just add one thing. I think that we need to start considering also in the context of global climate change, the increased amount of different weather impacts that we're receiving. So from wildfires, hurricanes, drought, and how households in the wake of this crisis are managing to have safe and reliable drinking water. So I think that moving forward and seeing that these events are increasing, research in the global north has to pivot to really understand how these complexities are addressed at the household and community levels.
Thank you. And just to sum up, I think it's important to acknowledge that water scholarship has advanced enormously in recent decades, particularly through interdisciplinary research. But despite this remarkable progress, water challenges seem to be growing more quickly than our capacity to solve them. And as Dr. Radonic and soon to be Dr. Roque mentioned, global climate change is truly threatening this progress. So this indicates a strong need for innovative measurement of who experiences water insecurity, new approaches for monitoring the efficacy of water interventions, and more effective management of complex, mobile, and multiple water infrastructures to achieve water security. So I've argued with my colleagues, Dr. Jepson, Chad Sadden, and Sarah Young, that we need to develop better methods to improve the measurement of water insecurity, pinpointing problems at the household and individual levels in ways that can inform policymaking with improved precision. Second, Doctors Patrick Thompson and Justin Stoller have argued that we need to use new information and communication technology to improve monitoring and indicate where water infrastructure investments are most needed. Third, Doctors Katie Meehan and Michelle Cooey have argued we need to advocate for new approaches to managing complex water infrastructures in more inclusive and more democratic ways that can better achieve water justice. A critical lesson that we've learned from scholars like Drs. Farhana Sultana and Raul Pacheco Vega is the need to elevate experts and expertise from the global South, including theories, solutions, and best practices into its central place in global water security leadership, given that the global north is lagging in tracking and addressing its water insecurity problems. So to sum up, I would argue, as I have done with many of my colleagues, that measurement, monitoring, and management are among the most important things to put on our roadmap. So now we'd like to move to the Q&A, and Dr. Jepson will be leading this with the assistance of Dr. Brewis.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you everybody on the panel. I see we have one question from Asher Rossinger, so welcome Asher. I can't see you, but it's good that you're here. And to what extent, I'm not sure what the group can see. So I'll read the question and then go through the panelists to address it. So Asher asked sort of, could we talk about the unintended health consequences of water insecurity, like potential nutritional consequences? He writes, I think that structural inequalities in the US, which can lead to water insecurity, have these nutritional consequences. And there's been some research showing that when people perceive their water as unsafe, they consume sugary drinks and sodas, as was mentioned earlier. And often this is because sodas can be cheaper than bottled water in places like corner stores. So this is trying to get at that other link between insecurity and health. And again, what are potential unintended consequences? So I'll first go to Alex Brewis, Dr. Brewis, and see who else wants to jump in.
So this is a really important point that Dr. Rossinger is sharing with us, which is that often in the broad scope of the field of wash and sanitation and the way that experts connect water and illness, often infectious disease is the focus and the risks associated with infectious disease. But in places like the US, often it's chronic diseases are the primary cause of morbidity and mortality, at least in normal years. And what we're starting to see is the need to really explicitly link how water insecurity has chronic disease outcomes. And there's several pathways, but how this can happen that we need to be better exploring. So one of them is how water insecurity shifts what people eat, both because of affordability and because of circumstances, also what people can cook and how they can prepare food. So you can track, or there's starting to be the capacity to track those pathways. There's also the psychosocial pathway where you have a different pattern of tracking towards chronic disease that is related to the stress of living with water insecurity, can do things like elevate blood pressure and so on in ways that will affect chronic disease. So I think making those connections is incredibly important to explaining how water insecurity underpins many aspects of health disparities in the global north, not just the obvious ones.
Anyone else would like to? Amber? Go ahead.
I can add on. So I'll just say that I recently finished writing a review piece with Dr. Radonich and 3 colleagues who aren't here with us today, Dr. Cassie Workman, Dr. Melissa Beresford, and Dr. Teresa Montoya. And we had the pleasure of reviewing Dr. Brewis's recent scholarship on this issue. And after a close reading, we were able to elucidate, what I think are really important sort of theoretical models for thinking forward about what's going on here. So Dr. Brewis and colleagues have hypothesized that water and food insecurity can be linked in what we believe are 8 ways. So water insecurity could drive food insecurity by lowering incomes, constraining food preparation, consuming the household budget, diverting labor from food acquisition and preparation, making food unsafe. And then on the flip side, food insecurity could drive water insecurity because water collection is energy intensive, hunger foods might require water intensive preparation, and food expenditures might be chosen over water. And so through HWISE, in a paper led by Dr. Brewis, looking at data from 27 sites in 21 low and middle income countries, she found a strong association between household water and food insecurity in a range of contexts. And the other thing I would want to highlight is that Dr. Cassie Workman is leading theorization in our group around syndemics. So this is an idea that political economic conditions can drive the co-occurrence of mutually enhancing epidemics or stressors. And her body of work is tracing and pushing forward an argument that syndemic theory is one of the best ways to theorize food and water interactions.
Excellent. Other comments from the panelists?
I just have a quick comment. In the case of Puerto Rico, it's also interesting to look at that when Dr. Rosinger mentioned the soda. So the government, so the military gave a lot of sodas and a lot of like sugary drinks to people in Puerto Rico in the wake of the hurricane. So it's also not only to think about how households engage with alternative drinking, but also who is the people or who are the institutions that are giving them these sugary drinks in the first place. So I think that's an area of research that needs to be further elaborated, because even in my own experiences being in Puerto Rico, I, for example, was eating a lot of food from the military that it was like highly on sodium. So I had a lot of stomach ache and a lot of different problems, and I was able to move through different places in the island because of my position working within the government. So I think that for households, that's also another important component when thinking about water insecurity, because the sources that are giving them these alternative liquids are the ones that they trust more. So we also have to think about how institutions such as the government are actually providing these type of resources, especially in the wake of crisis where households don't have any other wells to depend on other than the government primarily.
And let me just add one quick thing here, not so much on the nutritional front, but I'm thinking here about the long-term unknown consequences. I was recently working with some colleagues in Flint, and Mrs. Yvonne Lewis, who's from the Healthy Flint Coalition, local organization. One of their largest concerns is what we don't know yet. So thinking about what are the unintended health effects that contaminated water has on female reproduction, on the future health of fetuses. So there is a medical dimension there, but this connects to the research that many of the people in our network has been doing, and other anthropologists, on the stressors. What is the stress that these people live with without knowing what is going to be the impact on the long term? So I think that connecting the unintended and unknown health consequences with the mental stress.
Thank you. Dr. Bruce, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, Lucy Patton has a question about Flint as a particular case. So did people have other thoughts about how Flint plays into the emergence of this scholarship, or how the scholarship might connect to the Flint case?
I just in thinking about Flint broadly and sort of situating it within the scholarship. I think there's different ways to think about Flint, right? So one is what I talked about earlier, which is it really forced, I think, the analytics to place it within a larger political economy of causality, and trying to understand sort of how did we, from a technical problem or a political economic challenge, and what was the causality. But I think the one thing that I take away from Flint, and I'm not going to call it legacy because it's not over. This is a struggle that's continuing for the past 6 or 7 years, and I think it also highlights for water scholars, especially those of us who do center our work around questions of justice and equity, that we really need to take seriously our methodologies and how we do our work and how we do our research. And it seems to me that the Flint case, and it's very complex and has many different dimensions, but one which I take on board and try to think about, and I think I talked about it actually, talked about this question of how we do our work. We really need to understand community-based engagement, ethical research practices, working with local, those who have local knowledge, incorporating those views and those perspectives into our work. I think that has to be in parallel with or along with the actual research questions. So for me, Flint was a lesson, not only in the questions around security, water insecurity, but the practice of researchers in this space.
Was there other thoughts from the panel? No. Wendy, do you want to jump to the next question?
Oh,
I think-
Lucero.
Oh,
Yeah, Dr. Rodona.
Yes, I just wanted to jump in briefly on the Flint case. Yes, I mean, I second what Dr. Jepson said about the importance of community-based research. But I think, and this is something that you mentioned earlier too, I think that what is happening in Flint and what continues to happen in Flint today, and in a great way, the activism of the people in Flint has highlighted the fact that these are not extraordinary events, that Flint is just one very well-known example of the many instances of water insecurity in the United States. So I think that that has been very informative in terms of how are we learning from it. The other dimension that I think it has been interesting for us scholars has been to recognize again the knowledge, the emergent expertise that people are developing around water resources when they are faced by these conditions of water insecurity. So in the case of Flint, for example, one of the like political after effects has been that there has been more attention on strengthening water monitoring and strengthening water standards. So now Michigan has great water standards. But on the other hand of this, it has been that community members have become not everyone, but many community members have become educated about the process of water monitoring. And one of the questions is like, yes, it's not only what you're monitoring for, but what you are not monitoring for. And understanding that, for example, like water quality within a household, it's not the same throughout the whole day, but it might change during the times of the day because of how the water flows through the pipes. So there is all of this engagement and questioning that draws our attention to local expertise in the context of water insecurity. And I think that would have a strong role as we move forward, going back to what is it that we're going to do in terms of the role of the state for repairing infrastructure, for monitoring water security. So local actors are claiming a space there. And I think that's one of the legacies of the ongoing crisis in Flint.
Yeah, to jump in and just reiterate some of the really excellent points that Dr. Jepson and Dr. Radonich made and thread in some of the scholarship of our colleagues. I would just first begin by saying Flint is clearly an outrageous, horrific, enraging example of environmental injustice in the United States, right? And it's important that that be recognized. But what Dr. Radonich said is also true, that this is happening silently all around the world. When lay people ask me what my research is about, I say it's Flint in global context, right? Because Flint's story is not unique because of the environmental injustices. It's unique because people made themselves heard, right? So the scholarship of Dr. Ben Pali is important in tracing how that incredible effort of people on the ground in Flint to scream out the anguish that so many are feeling made itself heard. And so his book, Flint Fights Back, is a great way to learn about that. I would also want to point out, and I think both of you discussed this, one of the most important lessons for water scholars is that the way the community science relationships were handled in Flint caused harm. And we need to learn from that, and we need to do better. So our colleague, Dr. Yana Limbernidal, in my view, her voice is a beacon. I always check with her when I'm doing community-based work to think through, what are the ethical implications? Are we upholding justice? Are we avoiding being extractive and doing harm? Are we advancing the interests of communities we work in? And Flint is, unfortunately, a very instructive case, but one in which, again, people have made their voices heard, and we need to learn from what they're telling us about moving forward in a better way. And then finally, there's been incredible community-based work that we can learn from. So for example, we've talked a lot about affordability and shutoffs. The work of the Human Utility, which is led by Tiffany Ashley Bell, is a great example of how communities are advancing public knowledge around water injustices in the global north. Thanks.
Excellent. So we have just a couple minutes to wrap up, and actually this is really for Dr. Radonjic. So Patrick Thompson said he'd be grateful for you, as well as all the other panelists, your thoughts on expanding on about acceptability and cultural values, and how we reconcile this important issue with climate change driven efforts that lead to using recycled water and desalinated water for drinking water. So thinking about the questions of cultural values and acceptability, and I'll hand it off to Dr. Radonjic, and then last words, and we'll wrap up.
Okay, so basically in a minute, right? So I guess one of the things that I would say is that there's a lot for us to still understand. So my attention would be here on methods. How is it that we can develop methodologies to really understand how is it that our people are perceiving and differentially valuing different sources of water? Because you're right, with climate change, there is much more of an emphasis to develop all of these different technologies. I'm thinking here of the work of Carrie Jean Omerod at the University of Nevada at Reno, and she has been using the Q method to look at how is it that the different stakeholders conceptualize treated recycled water in Arizona, actually. And from there, we can move forward to think about policies. We can think about how is it that we come to manage and distribute these resources. And I think one other dimension that I think that we need to talk about when we are talking briefly about differential acceptability is also who gets to use these resources, and if there's any stigma associated with the use of specific sources of water for specific uses. So it's a very complicated question, and I would love to talk more about it, maybe in a different setting, since we're close enough here.
Yes, we are actually. So I'm going to hand it over to Amber for last thoughts.
Okay. Well, we thank you all so very much for joining us today. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we encourage everyone to join our community of practice in the Household Water Insecurity Network. That's HWISE-RCN.org. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us after the panel if you'd like to follow up or have further questions. Thank you.